Um, so we're going to be in John chapter 8. I'm going to turn over there. First 11 verses of John chapter 8. Move that down a little bit. That's what we're going to be covering today. I don't know if you're watching Terry Powell. I was going to say that I was going to make a joke and say that Terry called me yesterday and wanted me to finish up on Nicodemus because I understand he spent like three lessons on that. But we're going to move on today. And we're going to go to John chapter 8. And this is another in the series of the kind of people that Jesus dealt with in his ministry. And so I think before we get started, we'll begin with a prayer. And JC, would you lead us in prayer this morning?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, for its beauty and blessings, and this opportunity we have to see your word. Pray should be with Michael as he teaches us and help us all to derive much from it. Pray should be with those in the congregation who are sick and restore them back to their normal places. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, but in all seriousness, speaking about Nicodemus, what is the point of that story being in the Bible, do you think? Why is that recorded? And the reason I ask is, we talk about over in John chapter 20. Let's just go over there real quick. John chapter 20, 31 and 32. John 20, 30 and 31. John chapter 20, 30 and 31. What does it say there about, someone can read that.
And truly, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life through his name.
All right. So there were many, many things that Jesus did that are not recorded. So the question is, why were certain stories recorded and others not? Right? So the question is, what was it? What do you think the main point of recording the story of Nicodemus was? What's the main point of that? Any ideas? And by the way, I'm not saying there's a right and wrong answer, so don't feel intimidated, right? Like I know the right answer, and I'm waiting for you to get it wrong. What do you think? Why would that story be recorded?
For one, it shows a common struggle that people have come to get grips with Christ and who he is. Okay, that's true. It shows a common struggle. Here's Nicodemus, who's maybe a little embarrassed, to admit that he's a believer. But what is the teaching? What's the teaching in that story about?
Bring one to faith in Christ.
And the kingdom, yes.
The kingdom.
Right. It's the beginning of the kingdom teaching, right? It's an important part of that. And so there's some stories that are kept because obviously there's central teachings of who Christ was and his kingdom, right? So now we're going to read the story of the woman taken in adultery. And so what I'm going to come back to at the end of the lesson, all right, I want you to think about this. Why this story? Why was this story kept for us? What is it, when you read it, what do you take out of it? I think of like Nicodemus, for example. Certainly there's the story of the common struggle, but I see that as being a central part of the kingdom teaching, and maybe that's why it was kept. But I want to ask, what is the reason you think maybe this was kept? And like I said, there's no right and wrong answer. Yeah.
I've always thought that it's much more of a lesson on the attitude of the scribes and Pharisees that the woman committed adultery.
Yeah.
The fact that they're trying to trap them, their whole motivation was wrong.
Absolutely. Yes.
And he's highlighting that that's not the way it's going to be in his kingdom.
Right. Okay. Good. So that may be one of the reasons. But let's start off by reading this. And so it's a relatively short story. So I'm just going to ask one person to read the whole thing. John chapter 8, 1 through 11. If someone would take that, please.
But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. you say? This they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest, even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had raised himself up, and he saw no one but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, Lord. And Jesus said to her, Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more.
Okay. So I don't know if you guys got these lessons beforehand. So this isn't in the reading, but in John chapter 7, it tells us why Jesus was in Jerusalem at this time. Does anybody remember, by chance, what the feast was? There was a particular feast. It was the Feast of Tabernacles. And just roughly, someone want to tell us what was the Feast of Tabernacles to commemorate?
The wilderness wandering?
The wilderness wandering, that's right. And so the Jews actually had to build for themselves little huts out of palm branches or whatever it was, and they lived in these huts. And I grew up near a Jewish synagogue in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I remember, because I used to walk by there all the time, during a particular time of the year, they would actually have little houses built in the yard around the synagogue. Now, no one was living in them. It was more symbolic at that point. But that's what the Jews were to do. They were to live in these little houses to remember the wilderness wandering. So Jesus is there for this feast. And that's just kind of the idea here. And it says in verse 8, he had gone out to the Mount Olives. And from the top of the Mount Olives, you can see Jerusalem. So he spends the night in the Mount of Olives. And the next morning, he comes down from the Mount of Olives. And he goes into the temple to teach people. Okay. So I just kind of want to get this in your mind, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, also, you mentioned it was in the morning. In the text here, it says it was early in the morning.
Right, very early in the morning.
So this would probably have been pre-dawn, right when it's kind of twilight.
Yeah.
And I know we didn't read verse 12, but that's when Jesus declares himself to be the light of the world. It could be the case that it's just as the sun is coming up that he makes a declaration.
That's a great idea. Yeah, that's a great business. I had not thought about that. Yeah, that's great. So so let's think about that. It's early in the morning. People are just kind of getting up and moving around, but he's already in the temple teaching. And maybe, and I don't know, but maybe that's when people had time before they went to work. Maybe they came in early first thing in the morning to, hear about the teaching and then go to work. I don't know, but maybe. But anyway, the point is he's in the temple, right? And it says, and the people were coming to him. So there's a lot of people standing him around him, right? Listening to him teach. And what happens in verse 3? What's the action here?
But it seems like that brought is not like nicely escort her, but
Right.
kind of throw her out there.
Right. Okay, so yeah, that's great. You can imagine here all these people. Here's Jesus, and it says he sat down, and so he's sitting there, and all these people are standing around him, right? And you can just see all of a sudden these scribes and these Pharisees, excuse us, get out of our way. And the parts, and they just shove this woman out there, right? I mean, can't you visualize that in your mind? That he's calmly teaching, and they're like, get out of the way, move. And the crowds part, and they bring out this woman. And, just throw her out there in front of Jesus. But let's talk first about who the scribes and Pharisees were. And I know we already talked about this, but it's going to be important in the story later. What's the difference between a scribe and a Pharisee? They're mentioned together, but they're different. They're different. What was the job of a scribe?
They're like lawyers.
Okay, they were like lawyers. And when you think of a scribe, what do you think about?
Writing.
The word itself. Writing. Because remember, we take reading and writing for granted, right? Everybody does that. But, go ahead, what?
And arithmetic.
And arithmetic, yes, we do. We take those things for granted. But in this era, right, a scribe being able to write, especially the law, that was a highly trained, highly skilled profession. So these were, I don't know, what would be the equivalent? Like being a lawyer today, maybe, a high-end lawyer?
They would have been the scholars of their day.
Okay, the scholars.
Because having to copy the law and being trained in that, they would have known it better than most other even the average
Absolutely.
Pharisee.
Absolutely. And it would have been a position of great responsibility because you're copying the law. Yes?
I may be wrong, but I picture them as more sequestered and not really experienced in the ways of life in general, life experiences.
Maybe. And I don't know. That could be true. And so there's the scribes, and then who are the Pharisees over here on this end?
It's supposed to be spiritual leaders.
Spiritual leaders, right.
Supposed to be.
Right. So there, I read one commentator that said that the scribes were the ones who copied the law, and the Pharisees were the ones that kept the law. In other words, they were like the police force, right? They were making sure that everyone's obeying the law.
Before Jesus came along, they were the people's party, meaning they were the most popular sect of the Jews. Of all the different, they were more popular than the Sadducees.
The Sadducees, right? Because the Sadducees were more secular, for sure. The Pharisees were definitely, they wanted to keep the law, and they were experts in the law themselves. So here you have these, they come in, and and people would have known who they were. These would have people been held in high esteem among the Jews. So you can imagine the crowd is like, what's going on, right? I mean, here's Jesus teaching, and they at least believe he's a great teacher. And here are these people, and these other leaders, and they bring out this woman, and now they're going to bring these charges against her. And so you can imagine the crowd is just like the tension in the air, right? And there's just this bated breath, like, what's going to happen? Now, I find this is interesting. They say in verse 4, how do they address Jesus? Master. Well, we know it's going to tell, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more. They're bringing this woman here to trick Jesus, to try to set him up. So why would they call him that? Another word is teacher. That's what I have. So if they're here and they don't respect him, they're trying to trip him up, why call him that? Hypocrisy?
The benefit of the crowd around, thinking that they respect him.
Okay. I think that's right, because they knew the crowd respected him, right? And so I think this is just so, what would we say, duplicitous. It's hypocritical. It's like, oh, teacher, that's an honorific title, right? So, okay, we're going to acknowledge that you're a teacher. But they didn't mean it. Or at least that, they didn't like, oh, okay, we'll say this because that's what the people think. But it wasn't in their hearts. And so this is just a great scene here we can put out before us. And what do they say here? What do they say the woman was caught doing? Adultery. And more than just an adultery, what about it? In the very act. Okay, this isn't a rumor, Jesus. This isn't just something we heard about. We caught her in the very act. Now, what is different about this scenario than other scenarios when people would come to test Jesus? Right? Think of some other questions when people were testing Jesus. Like, for example, when the Sadducees came and said, well, there was this guy and she, this woman, and she was married, and her husband died, and then the next husband died, and there were 7 brothers, and they all died. She was married to all of them. Whose husband will be? Who will she be married to in heaven? Right? And there were questions like that. Or the Pharisees came and said, "What's the greatest commandment?" What's the difference between this scenario?
This is personal.
This is personal. There's a human involved. Those are more abstract. Like these are questions of the law. Like, oh, we're going to sit around and debate the finer points of the law. This is different. This is a person's life, right, before them. So again, that increases the tension. It's not abstract anymore, and it's like when we debate the scriptures.
And where's the man?
Okay, we're going to get to that. Okay, we're going to get to that. We're going to read this. We're going to read them.
It also forces Jesus to react in some way.
Yeah.
Instead of just ignoring it, which he kind of does here, but it puts more pressure on Jesus, I guess
Right.
you would say.
That's true. It does put pressure on him. Yeah. That's
I think
exactly
it's
right.
so unkind of them to treat this woman this way, just to test Jesus. They don't care about her.
Right.
test Jesus.
That's
And
right.
that's just so horrible.
Right. They clearly don't care about the woman.
No.
It's just they're using her, right? And so, sometimes there's a difference when we talk about the scriptures, about what sin is and what God expects in marriage and things like that we can talk abstractly. But then when it comes down to, oh, wait a minute, this is going to affect someone's life. Someone may have to make a change in their life and their choices. And suddenly, all of a sudden, people are like, wait a minute. You're really taking this seriously here. You're telling someone they have to change their life. Then it's not abstract anymore. And so, as we're going to see, that's exactly what it is. Here's this woman, and it builds the tension. Yeah, Eugene?
Would they normally have taken that woman out and stoned her?
So let's talk about that. First, let's see the charges. Let's read the background of it. And that's a very good question. And let's talk about that. Mike, did you have something?
No, I lost it.
Oh, okay. That's okay. Yeah, I've been blah, 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 and lost your train of thought. I gotcha. So let's go over, well, what do they say here? They say, in the very act, now the law of Moses condemned us to stone such women, and then what do you say? So let's read that. Let's go over to several places. And Deuteronomy 22, Deuteronomy chapter 22, and we're going to read verses 22 and 23. Well, let's start in Leviticus. I'm sorry. Actually, the first time it's mentioned is in Leviticus, so let's go there first. Let's go to Leviticus 20:10. Leviticus 20:10. And somebody read that. Leviticus 20:10, whenever somebody gets there.
And the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death.
Okay. So, it does command death, but it commands death for who? Both. That's right, both. And guess what? If you're caught in the act, that probably means there were two people there, right? So if they caught her in the act, that means they knew who she was committing adultery with. All right. So, but let's go on now and read in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 22. Deuteronomy 22, and I want to read 22 and 23. Someone go ahead and read that.
If a man be found lying with a woman married to the husband, then they shall both of them die. Both the man that lay with the woman and the woman so shall be put away evil from Israel. If a damsel is a virgin, be betrothed to a husband, and a man finds her in the city of love with her. I guess I should be
24, yeah, sorry,
Then
24.
shall you bring them both out into the gate of the city, and shall stone them with stones until they die. The damsel, because she cried not, being the city, and the man, because he had humbled his neighbor's wife. So shall thou put away evil from among you.
So, certainly, we can see this, that death was prescribed for adultery, but was stoning for all adultery? If you read verse 23 and verse 20 in Deuteronomy, it said there's actually stoning is only specifically prescribed for if it's a virgin, like someone who's betrothed to someone else, right? She's not married yet, and she is sleeping with a man who's not her husband, because in that day, if you were engaged to someone, it was like being married to them, right? So here's a woman who's engaged to a man but never been with a man, but she sleeps with a man. In that case, stoning was specifically prescribed. But those other verses, and tell me if you think I'm wrong here, those other verses just say that for the case of adultery, death is prescribed. It doesn't say how. So, I just thought that was interesting. So maybe they're correct here, maybe they're not, but they say, yeah, go ahead, Art.
No, finish your thought.
No, so when the scribes and the Pharisees say, well, it says to stone her, well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Go ahead.
From what I was reading, like in the case of Mary and Joseph, when Mary was found to be pregnant, and of course, he didn't know about the Holy Spirit.
Right.
He wanted to put her away privately.
Right.
But even in that case, adultery probably was expected.
Right.
Or thought of. So not all adultery cases ended in stoning in that day and time.
Right.
There were a lot that didn't. Now, it might be very different in the fact that you were caught in the very act. Most people didn't get caught in the very act. It almost seems like maybe the Pharisees and the scribes, they knew of a situation where they could catch this woman.
Right.
Maybe this was a common thing that went on, or maybe they even set it up. I mean, we can only speculate.
Yeah.
But anyway, so just my main point, though, is that not all cases of adultery ended in stoning.
Right.
The example of Mary would have been one of them.
Right, exactly. And in fact, when he says they were saying this to test him so that they might have grounds of accusing him, what's the test? If it's like, okay, the law says we caught this woman in adultery, we need to stone her, and like I said, maybe it was stoning or maybe it was just some other kind of put to death, but nevertheless, what's in logic they call it the horns of the dilemma, right? Like no matter which option you choose, it's wrong. What's the horns of the dilemma here? Yeah, Mike?
Well, Jesus has been preaching that he's there for the sick, he's there for those who need a doctor.
Okay.
That sins can be forgiven. He's shown through some of his miracles that he's healed somebody, says your sins are forgiven, and sin no more,
Okay.
like he does later on here. So they already know that mind frame of forgiveness of sins. Jesus is hanging around with these sinners.
Right.
Put it so now we're going to put him to the test. Is he going to follow the law, or is he going to give way to the sinner? And what he shows them basically is that all have sinned, and just some get caught.
So what was Jesus known as? The friend of sinners, right? And so they knew that Jesus hung around with sinners, right? And publicans and sinners. And so the question is, well, is Jesus then, here's this woman who's a sinner, that's part of it, is he just going to excuse the sin? Ignore the law and just let her off the hook. So that's part of it. What's the other thing? What about the Romans? During these days, and I'm sure some of you know this, but of course, they were of course under Roman rule. And so the Romans had taken away their right to capital punishment. That's why, remember, they couldn't crucify Jesus, even though, he committed blasphemy. They had to go get permission from Pontius Pilate, because the Romans said, you can't do capital punishment. You have to get our permission first. So, what they're saying here is, okay, Jesus, the law says we should put her to death. If you say, yes, put her to death, follow the law, one, like you said, Mike, there's the question of compassion, right? And compassion for sinners, but it's also, are you going to go against the Romans, right? Are you going to say, well, it doesn't matter what the Romans say, go ahead and put her to death, and so and violate the Roman law, and then they could have him arrested for that, or are you going to violate the old law, the law of God, and then they could say, well, look, he doesn't respect the law of God. Yeah, JC.
This is sort of a law of action. You have to have two witnesses to sentence to
Right.
anyway, right?
Right.
And no, we're here to read though that these are the witnesses.
Right. And so that's a good point. In fact, let's read that. That's over in Deuteronomy 17, because that's another point of the law that we need to bring up. Deuteronomy 17, verses 6 and 7. Deuteronomy 17, verses 6 and 7. Someone read that when you get there.
Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness.
Right. And read verse 7 too.
The hands of the witness shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all of the people. So you shall put away your evil from among you.
Right. Okay. So that's right. So like JC just said, there was also a requirement in the law that there be 2 or 3 witnesses brought forward, and if they were condemned to death, the witness was the first one that was supposed to strike the person. Right? They were supposed to do the act, if you will. Let's see, where was I? All right. So here are these experts in the law. Yeah, go ahead.
You know, I find that very interesting that the witness has to be, if he's going to make such an accusation, he has to be engaged in the
Yeah.
capital punishment.
Right.
They told us in preaching school, if the gossip comes to you and starts gossiping about everyone, write it down, get them to sign their name to it.
Yeah.
And or maybe take them and say, let's go talk to that person you're talking about. A lot of times people say, no, I don't want to do that.
Exactly.
Because that puts that responsibility on them.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And of course, back in those days, they didn't have forensic evidence and all that. But can you imagine if we did that today? Like, okay, if you're going to be a witness against this person, you have to be the one who throws the switch on the electric chair. Or you have to be the one that locks them in prison, right? You have to look at them and do that. That would make people, I think, a lot more careful about what they said, right? So yeah, Mike?
Well, I think when you look at the punishments, a lot of times it was the stoning, and
Sure.
that's because it brings the community together. We are all involved. The accuser first,
Mm-hmm.
and the community as a whole, all together are putting this person to death.
Okay, yeah, good thought. But what I wanted to think was, so here, these are the people who are the experts in the law, right? And so if they're the experts in the law, and they caught her in the act, why didn't they just go ahead and pass judgment? They're the experts in the law. And they caught her in the act, so they must have seen it. So why don't they just go ahead and pass judgment? Why even bring it to Jesus?
They don't want to get their hands dirty.
They don't want to get their hands dirty, right? Right. And it goes back to what you said earlier. They don't care about the woman. They're not really because I think, as Art said, that probably adultery was fairly common, right, at this time. And it happened at least. And so not everyone got stoned, or even not everyone got punished, right? And so they don't care about this woman. This just happens to be an opportunity for them to look for a chance to. And I just think that's ironic. It's like, well, you're the guys of the law. You caught her. Why don't you just do it yourselves? Why are you bringing it to me, right? And I think this is another important point that we make here, because this sort of influences, I think, when we get to the end of the story. This is, if you will, a matter for the courts, right? This is, okay, she was caught doing this, so the courts need to decide whether she's guilty or not. Was Jesus a judge? No, he even said, I came not to judge, right? And what about the story? There's the reference in here. Let me see if I can find it. Where, the person came to him and said, maybe you can remember where it is, Art. Jesus, make my brother divide the inheritance with me. Remember that story? And what did Jesus say?
Who made me a ruler?
Yeah, who made me a judge over you? This is a matter for the courts. And so, in a sense here, this is a matter for the courts. They already said, well, we're not going to handle it. We'll see what Jesus has to say about it, because they're going to test him. And it says that they might have grounds for accusing him. So the word, I understand, test here means test specifically to see if you're going to fail, right? That they want him to fail one way or another. Now, it says, what does Jesus do, of course? He stoops down and writes on the ground with his finger. Now, I always had trouble picturing this, right? Because I always thought, if you've ever tried to write in the dirt, you can't tell what you're writing, right? It's like, what's going on there? But a commentary I read on this made a lot more sense. If you were in the temple, there would have been paving stones. So there were smooth stones, and of course it's really dusty in Jerusalem. So you can see him writing in the dust. So it's like if there's dirt on your rear windshield, right? You ever see people write in the dirt on somebody's rear windshield? In their car, or the back of a truck that's dirty, and you can clearly see what it says. So that made more sense to me. All right, so here Jesus is writing something on the ground. Now, I know in verse 6, and there's a version that says as if he did not hear them. My understanding is my version doesn't say that. That's not a very good textual reading. At least some feel that way. So we can't imply here that it says as if he did not hear them, right? But let's talk about what he may have been writing, because we don't know, of course, but maybe we can think about that a little bit. So what do you think? What kind of things might he have been writing? Any speculations?
Their sins.
What? Their sins. Okay, that's one idea. That maybe he was writing out their names, right? Maybe because they were guilty of the same thing. And he's like, I know, that he knew the hearts of men that nobody else did. So maybe he was writing out other sins that they had committed, knowing that could be. Did you have a thought? Okay. I thought maybe he was just doodling, right? Maybe he wasn't writing anything. Maybe he was just letting the tension build. Because here, they brought on this woman and said, Jesus, what does the law say? And so he just stoops down, right, and he's just writing something. Maybe he's just doodling on the ground, right? And so you can see the tension building. And so they keep asking him, Jesus, what do you say? What do you say, Jesus? And he's not responding to them. And so you can imagine the crowd also, the tension is building in the crowd. Yeah.
And that's a very good tactic. I've seen situations where there was a debate or an argument.
Yeah.
And one side is just almost yelling.
Yeah.
And the other side, he even gets quieter.
Right.
Just to magnify the anger and the absurdity of the other side. Exactly.
And so no matter what he was writing, I think this tactic that's part of the tactic here. So somebody suggested that maybe what he was writing is, one of the commentators, was Exodus 23 and verse 1. Let's go over there and read that. Exodus 23 and verse 1. And somebody, when you get over to Exodus 23 and verse 1, read that.
Thou shalt not rise a false report, but not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness.
Right. So don't bear a false report, and don't join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. And so maybe what he's implying here is, here are these wicked men who, and they don't even bring the witnesses, right? Like JC had said, they're supposed to have 2 or 3 witnesses, but where are the witnesses? And where is the man who was caught in the act with the woman? So clearly, they're not interested in the law, and maybe he's trying to remind them of what the law says. But I love this in verse 7. It says they persisted in asking him, like he was saying. So you can just see them peppering with questions, and there's the crowd, they're in silence and the tension. And then he just stands up, and he looks at them, and he says, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." So what's he doing here by saying this? He's shifting the focus from what to what?
It's going through the horns of the dilemma.
Right? He is. Yes. He's outsmarting them. He's outfoxing them. And by shifting the focus. Yeah.
Putting the focus back on self. Because,
that's right.
As I said, the real issue is we're all sinners, just some get caught.
Right.
And so that's what the law, just like, our legal system, there's plenty of people that go out and commit crimes that never get caught.
Sure.
Those who get caught go to jail.
Right.
So that's what the law of the Old Testament was. Some get caught and they get punished, others get away.
Sure. I mean, Paul tells us that the reason for the law was to make us aware of sin. Right. That's why we had the old law. But he shifts the focus because they're concentrating on her sin, even though they didn't really care about her. They're instead of their own sin. Okay. So what's the application for us in our lives? Have you ever been so focused maybe on what other people are doing that we don't look at our lives? And let me give you an example. I don't know about the rest of you, but I have been, Pride Month just grates on me. When I see these pride festivals in New York where people are dressed in just outlandish, ungodly ways, chanting, "We're coming for your children," that just makes me so angry. And sometimes I think, though, that I get so focused on being angry at them for them and their sin that I lose sight of my own sin. Am I so concerned about what they're doing that I'm not looking at myself? How am I contributing to the darkness? How am I not walking in the light? And it's easy to be so angry at that exaggerated, just clear sin that I don't have to deal with myself. Right? I can worry about the other people, and God, you need to do something about them, but what about me? What about me and my own sin? But that's what I see from it. And so he just stands up and says this, and you can see him saying in a very calm voice. They're shouting and they're angry. And he says, well, let him without sin throw the first stone, and then he stoops down again and lets it get quiet. And so what do you imagine happens after that? Can you imagine? It's sort of just maybe describe the scene for me, right? What that must have been like. How quiet it must have been, right? Like everyone is just waiting, and Jesus says this, and then he stoops back down, and then everyone's silent. Can you imagine
They're
that?
ashamed, and people nowadays generally are not ashamed of their sin. We have to go back to being ashamed of our sin.
Sure.
And we don't do that. We
Sure.
always make excuses. We're like, wow. So there's so many times I see signs up, I'm not ashamed. I'm prideful. I'm not ashamed. Whatever the sin is. And so we need to start being ashamed. Jesus died for us.
Okay.
And we need to be ashamed.
So who in this story do you think was ashamed of their sin?
Finally, the people and the scribes and Pharisees.
You think they were ashamed of what they had done?
No, but at the moment they were.
Okay.
At the moment.
Okay.
So to me, what Jesus wrote both times, it doesn't matter.
Right.
The
You're
lessons
right, it
that I
doesn't.
learned, because it would tell us if it mattered.
Right. I agree
What
with you.
I
agree.
learned is, first, the scribes, Jesus was always talking hard to the scribes and
Sure.
Pharisees.
Sure.
Always. But
Sure.
the everyday people, he was kind and gentle and patient with. He loved the scribes and Pharisees just like the people, but they were hardened heart. So he had
Right.
a heart firm to them. The
Okay.
people are trying to learn. They want to know Jesus. So he's kind, compassionate, and teaches them gently about their sin and how to go about repenting.
Okay.
So the right stuff, it doesn't matter.
Agreed.
What is important is the lessons we learn in that little bit. And so did the scribes and Pharisees learn? Some did, some didn't. Did the people learn? Some did, some didn't. But he showed godliness. He showed godly justice.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Did you want to say something, Art?
Well, I just picture, they come to Jesus and they're like, what should we do, Master? What should
Right.
we do, Teacher? And so they're waiting for some kind of action
Right.
from him. And then finally he says, okay, go ahead and stone her, but let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And he ruined their whole scenario.
Right.
He just ruined it for them.
Yes.
Because now who's going to dare cast a stone and claim he's sinless? Because
Right.
now they're going to look bad in front of the
Right.
people.
Right.
And so that's what I get the sense of, is their conscience, yes, is getting to them, but it may not be
For the right reasons?
For the right reasons.
Yeah, yeah.
He just ruined it. He just
Right.
ruined their whole situation. You gotta love it.
And so what do you do if you're the scribes and the Pharisees and Jesus just like slams you, right? And you're like, I can't think of anything to say. So what happens?
They lead from the oldest to the youngest.
They just like, okay, I'm just gonna walk. Can't you imagine them just kind of melting into the crowd? Like, okay, I'm just gonna kind of slip away. And they don't all leave at once. Like, it's gradual. They just kind of, okay. Yeah, and I don't know if you've ever had a situation like this. You don't know what to say, so you just kind of wander off, right? Because so you can imagine how humiliated they must have been. I don't necessarily think because they thought they were sinners, but they were humiliated because they were supposed to be the great teachers, and Jesus just shuts them down. But why the oldest to the youngest? It specifically says that in the story. Why the oldest to the youngest?
Because we remember the wicked things we did when we were younger.
Well, that's true. I sure do, yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I visualize this group as a good old boys club back then. They knew each other.
They knew each other.
There's
Absolutely.
mobs, there's leaders, and then there's tag-alongs.
Right.
And so, maybe the deeper you are in it, the more convicted you might be. I've really messed up. I can just see when they got outside, they stood up and grabbed the others and said, what have you got us into?
Yeah, exactly.
This was really ill-considered.
Yeah. Yeah, that didn't go the right way, did it?
I got to work deep inside. they stalking this woman, and she
Yes.
refused some of them.
Yeah.
There's more to this than we'll ever know.
Yes, exactly. And I read a commentator too, and Art referred to it, is maybe this was all set up. Maybe they knew, maybe she was a prostitute, and they knew that men went into her, and so they're like, okay, we're going to go get this prostitute. We don't know. But we're almost out of time, and I do want to make sure we get to that question I asked in the beginning, but I want to finish real quick in verses 10 and verses 11. So now Jesus stands up, and Landry, you made a very good point in the beginning of it, how this woman must have felt. Can you imagine being dragged in front of all these people and just like thrown down in Jesus in front of a giant crowd and said, this woman's an adulterer? How must she have felt? Just utterly shamed and humiliated and crushed. I mean, all these eyes on her. I mean, I just can't imagine what that must have been like for her. And so Jesus stands up, and now they all leave, and it's just quiet, and she's still just standing there. You know, and there's still a bunch of people standing around. And so Jesus just says, where are they? Does no one condemn you? In other words, where are the witnesses? You know? And she says, no one. But now look what she calls him. Lord. Lord. That means master. That different than the master that they called him teacher, an honor. Oh yeah, you're a great teacher. She calls him Lord. That's a whole different attitude. That means like a master of a slave. Like, you're the Lord. And so I don't know if she repented. She doesn't confess her sins here. She doesn't say I'm a sinner, but she does call him Lord, which I think shows a sincere heart. And he says, but neither do I do not condemn you either. But if she had broken the law, why didn't he condemn her? If she was guilty of sin, why didn't he condemn her?
Well, he knew her heart, and he knew if she was already repentant, when they threw her down, she might have already been repentant and sorrowful because she was listening to all Jesus was saying.
Okay.
And he knew her heart, and so he forgave her.
Were you going to say something, JC?
No, well, except if he were in front of people, be portrayed as a teacher and not the Son of God, he had no evidence.
Right. Could he condemn her according to the law? No, because there were not 2 or 3 witnesses. So technically, according to the law, he couldn't condemn her anyway, right? Because he has said repeatedly, this was a civil matter. But he says, go from now on, go and sin no more. In other words, he implies that he knew she was a sinner, right? And like, okay, you got off the hook on this one because we don't, we don't have the witnesses, so I can't condemn you according to the law. But what's the difference between Jesus in this situation versus when he comes back? When he comes back for the second time, how is he going to come? As judge. That's what I'm trying to get to. That he's coming back as ultimate judge. And so I get sort of, he's saying, okay, go and sin no more, because next time, if you're guilty, I will judge you. If you're guilty next time without being redeemed, I will condemn you. I don't condemn you this time because I can't. There are no witnesses. I can't condemn you according to the law. But next time I will.
The time hasn't come yet.
The time hasn't come yet. Yeah.
Jesus didn't have to tell her she was a sinner. The Pharisees already did that.
Right.
He gave sinners hope that they can get out of their sin.
Right.
Most people caught in sin want to get out of it. He gave
Right.
them that hope.
But he gave her with a warning. Go and sin no more. Stop it. You got out of it this time, but next time when I come as judge, you won't. None of us will. Right. So in the couple of minutes we have left, just real quick, go back to the question, why this story? Why do you think this story is kept? Because it's not really about doctrine so much. So why? It's not about the coming of the kingdom. So why this story? And some of you already alluded to it, but Jason, huh?
Attitudes.
Attitudes, right? Okay, the attitudes we ought to have towards ourselves and others. And Landry, I think you already said it pretty well. The idea that there being mercy, right? That's what I get out of this. That Jesus is merciful, but there's a warning that ultimately we will be held in judgment. Go and sin no more. I'm here to redeem those sins, but with the expectation that you stop it and you give up your life of sin.
That's for verse 12 when he says, I'm the light of the world.
Oh, yeah, and then he goes right into, good point, Art. Good point. Excellent point. All right, we are out of time, I hope, right? Is it a quarter till, and then when we start? Okay. Thanks, everybody.